Hi, I'd like to welcome you to a webinar that West Virginia CAN has designed for Child Advocacy Center staff and board members. My name is Emily Chittenden-Laird, and I'm the director of the West Virginia Child Advocacy Network. You're probably either new to your CAC in a position as a forensic interviewer or as a therapist, or you might be a new board member. Either way, we really wanted to create this so that on a statewide level we could have a way to give folks some context so that they understand the history of the Child Advocacy Center movement nationally and also here in West Virginia. So what is a Child Advocacy Center? The first question, this visual is of some different child advocacy centers around the state. The CAC movement really evolved from local communities in different ways in West Virginia, but I think one of the same things that really led everyone to realize the need for a child advocacy center was that the systems that were designed to help children were really re-traumatizing them. You see here a visual of a child, Robin, and this is just a hypothetical, but Robin, age 5, discloses at school and tells her teacher that she's being hurt at home. For this example, we'll just say it was Robin's stepfather was sexually molesting her. So she discloses at school and tells her principal, who says, okay, well, we need to get the counselor involved because that's our protocol here in the school. And so the principal calls the counselor, and then the counselor says, okay, I know what we're supposed to do. We need to make a report to Child Protective Services and law enforcement because we're mandated reporters. Then Robin moves on, and the police officer pulls up in front of the school and comes inside, and then Robin has to tell her story again to the police officer. Then the police officer says, well, I think that we really need to get you checked out medically because, what if something's going on here? So takes her to the local hospital and presents. In the hospital, Robin tells her story again, and the hospital says, you know what, there's a children's hospital that's really way more qualified to do this than we are, so let's go ahead and make sure that she gets checked out there. So then she goes to the children's hospital and tells her story again. And now by this time, the CPS worker, who was busy on another case, was freed up. So she decided that she was able to come over, and now Robin has to tell her story again to the CPS worker. And you can see how this progresses through the system. Robin has to tell her story time after time after time, which is really re-traumatizing to her. She's telling about something so intimate and personal. And the messages, if you think through that, what is she hearing? What's the message when she has to go to the principal's office in the first place? When you're a kid, you have all these assumptions. If they go unchecked, then you don't have the reality to lead you back to the right place. So she thinks she's in trouble. And then a law enforcement officer calls up. So again, she thinks that she's going to jail or someone's going to jail. She goes to the hospital. The message is that she's sick. If you think about all the messages Robin's getting and probably not feeling believed, because why does she have to tell her story so many times? The other problem that this model presented was that whenever you're a prosecutor and you get this case on your desk and you have Robin that's interviewed 5, 6, 7 times by all these different folks, you have several accounts, and it's very challenging to take this forward in a criminal case. So the flip side of this is that offenders weren't held accountable. Child advocacy centers were really designed to change the way communities respond to child abuse. So now what happens, instead of going to all those different people and having to tell her story so many different times, Robin will go to a child advocacy center. A child advocacy center is designed to be a neutral, child-friendly setting in which a child feels safe to tell if something has happened to her. Robin is, instead of meeting every professional separately, all the professionals come to her. And so earlier when we talked about law enforcement and Child Protective Services and all these folks that she needs to tell her story, that investigative team is able to be there at the Child Advocacy Center. And then she's interviewed by a trained forensic interviewer. That interviewer has training in national standards. They have ongoing education, so they know how to talk to a child in a way that's neutral, fact-finding, developmentally appropriate, so that they're getting information from her if she does have something to disclose. If she doesn't have something to disclose, it's a great way to say, you know what, nothing is going on here. And so all of these different agencies don't need to invest our resources because there's nothing that's happened to Robin. And so it really encourages disclosures. I mean, the difference between going to a child advocacy center and being pulled into the back of a police car or having to go into the sheriff's department, it's just night and day for a child. So that psychological safety is really important that a child advocacy center designs. and creates. The second piece of that is whenever Robin comes to the Child Advocacy Center, her non-offending caregiver, maybe her mother, maybe her father, maybe it's a grandparent, but the adult that's bringing her to the center is met and immediately connected with an advocate. The reality is whenever kids disclose sexual abuse, many a times it just sends their families into a tailspin. And in addition to the crisis of, wow, something really incredible is going on with our child that maybe we didn't know about, it can present additional challenges. For example, what if the perpetrator was the breadwinner for the family? Then that family is left with no resources. They may now need to get assistance with food. They may need to find some shelter in the meantime if they're not able to go back to their home. So there are lots of immediate needs that families have, and so that family advocate helps them by saying, how are we going to get to tomorrow? What do you need from me to get to tomorrow? And they also really start to talk to that family about what can you expect to happen down the road as this case progresses through the criminal justice system. So it's really meeting the immediate needs of that family and then working with them throughout the process. That advocate then can serve as a liaison between the family and all of the different investigators so that whenever they say, where is our case in the criminal process, they don't have to wait for the police officer who's really busy to call them back, but the advocate knows the status of the case at all times, which is great because families need to know that for safety and for their own psychological comfort. Once the interview ends, if Robin has disclosed something, then she and her family are connected with resources that really help them begin to heal. A medical evaluation to make sure that both her body is okay and that she knows and is communicated that, you know what, I can't tell that anything's wrong with you. You're okay. It's amazing to me the things that children, again, if their realities are unchecked, think. Little kids oftentimes think that people just know that something's been going on with them. So to have a medical professional, a doctor say to them, you know what, I've looked at you and you're okay, is really, really healing for a child. The child would then be connected with a counselor and their family members as well so that they can begin to really begin their path to healing. So you can see the total difference between what happens with the Child Advocacy Center, where everyone's really wrapping around the child and helping that child begin their path to healing, versus the old system, which was oftentimes re-traumatizing. So how did it all begin? Where did this come from? Back in 1985, there was a district attorney whose name is Bud Kramer, and he was in Huntsville, Alabama, and he was the elected prosecutor there. And he was really disturbed by the way that they were handling child abuse cases. He saw what we saw in that first slide with Robin, that kids were having to talk to so many different people. They were really experiencing additional trauma at the hands of the system. And so he said, okay, we need to go and find a better model. And so he had several folks who worked for him, and he said, go and find it. And what he found is that there really wasn't a better model. No one had yet designed a system that was really sensitive to the needs of a child and that really was designed to lessen trauma for that child. So Bud Kramer started the first Child Advocacy Center. It was in a little tiny house in Huntsville, Alabama, and now today is known as the National Children's Advocacy Center. And you can see a picture of the National Children's Advocacy Center today. It's actually an incredible campus that has many training facilities and resources for individuals that are doing this work all across the country. They're a real leader in the movement. In 1987, Bud Kramer also began to get connected with other professionals who saw what they were doing in Huntsville and said, we really need to replicate this in our own community. And so child advocacy centers began to crop up all across the nation. And so he first established the National Network of Child Advocacy Centers. And that was out of the National Children's Advocacy Center, which then they rebranded after a few years as the National Children's Alliance, and they moved to Washington, D.C. so that they could have more of a presence for public policy and for funding and things like that. Bud Kramer then became a congressman, which was a great thing to happen for our movement. And in 1990, the Victims of Child Abuse Act was authorized. The Victims of Child Abuse Act does several things. It creates a funding source for accredited children's advocacy centers that are accredited through the National Children's Alliance. It also funds the regional children's advocacy centers, which I will talk about in a moment. Some of the training activities that go on at the National Child Advocacy Center in Huntsville, and then also funds some additional training and technical assistance for the disciplines that work as professionals in child abuse. In 1992 was when the first funding was appropriated, so there's an authorization and there's the funding appropriation. So 1992 was a really key moment nationally for child advocacy centers. And if we look at how this all began in West Virginia, it's a bit of a different story. 1999 was the first associate member of the National Children's Alliance in West Virginia, and that was the Summers County Child Advocacy Center in Hinton. And at that time, there were several child advocacy centers beginning to crop up all across the state. Most of them were actually in southern West Virginia. And so in 2001, a group began to meet, sort of how the National Children's Alliance was formed. It was a similar thing. There were professionals that wanted to network, and they wanted to get together and learn from one another and hear that their struggles were similar, and how did we get past this? And so in 2001, that group began to meet informally as an informal networking association. In 2003, they learned that there was also a CAC forming up in Wheeling. And so the Southern group expanded to be a statewide group, which was officially the West Virginia Child Advocacy Network. That group began to progress as an informal network of professionals, and then in 2006, this was a really key moment in West Virginia because the first 2 child advocacy centers were accredited by the National Children's Alliance, and those were in Lewisburg and Fayetteville. That was a really key moment for West Virginia because it really brought us on the map in the national scene. So now we're going to cut to a video of Judge Mary Ellen Griffith. She's now a family court judge in Princeton, West Virginia, but she was really involved at the beginning of the Child Advocacy Center movement. I'm going to describe a little bit about what those early years were like.
Working with the West Virginia Child Advocacy Network at its inception is one of the highlights of my career. We got together initially a number of assistant prosecutors, child protective service workers, children's attorneys, community folks who had an idea that we needed to do more to work with children who had been abused. And it just came together in such a positive way. It grew really out of the southern part of the state. The southern counties were the first counties to develop child advocacy centers. And we would get together once every 3 months to talk about our common problems and how we could solve those problems and how we could expand the movement around the state, created the Speakers Bureau. I had so much fun traveling all over West Virginia. I went to Wheeling, I went to Logan, I went to Berkeley Springs. I went all over talking to people about child advocacy centers, and I met just the greatest people. And I talked to community groups, and you know, in one community it might be the Junior League who is pulling it together. In another community it might be the domestic violence shelter. In another community the driving force could be the county judge. You just didn't know all the ways that people would come together to protect these vulnerable children. It was such an exciting thing to be part of, and I just have to say now when I see everything that they continue to do and are doing today, it's just an inspiration to have been involved with such a dynamic organization.
So really, from those early years, a really key moment for us as a statewide movement was in 2006 when the West Virginia Child Advocacy Network was incorporated. Because we then had 2 accredited child advocacy centers, we were able to apply for membership with the National Children's Alliance. And so that's when things really began to gel for us as a statewide network. In 2007, we had our first legislative agenda in which CACs were defined in state code, which really lended some credibility to what we were doing. It let folks know that this is a real part now of the child protection system in West Virginia. And then in 2008, we obtained our first state funding. I think that was probably the most key moment in the development of CACs in West Virginia. Child advocacy centers had been working to get different sources of local funding for a very long time, but this was the first time that we had a stable source of funding for centers all across the state. And it also put centers on a timeline of 5 years and said that they needed to be working toward accreditation with the National Children's Alliance, or else they wouldn't be funded going into the future. So all of our child advocacy centers began to get really serious at that time about working toward national accreditation. The other thing that funding allowed us to do is hire our first staff. And so West Virginia CAN was no longer this informal networking association, but it was an association that had staff that could start to work on things like training, technical assistance, public policy. And so that was really a key moment statewide. One thing I wanted to emphasize at this point was that child advocacy centers are all designed to be built on a grassroots movement. You heard about back in Huntsville, Alabama, what caused that community to say, you know what, we need to do things differently. And many times people will come to me and say, we really need a child advocacy center in this county, or I see that place in the map as vacant. But it really has to come from the local professionals, from the local community that says, this is something we want to do better in our community, and our children need a better response. It's so important because without that buy-in, a child advocacy center cannot succeed. And so you saw it both in Huntsville, Alabama, you saw it in West Virginia, but these communities all came up together and said from themselves, this is something that we want to do. We want to change the way that we respond to child abuse. So the National Children's Alliance is the national body that sets forth accreditation standards and is the membership body for all child advocacy centers in the United States. They have 10 standards for accreditation, which are required to be met no matter where you are in the United States. And the thing that I love about our standards is that they say to me that a child in Welch, West Virginia deserves the same response and the same core level of service that a child in Charleston or Morgantown should have. It's been a really great way in West Virginia to make sure that there are wraparound services for every child who discloses abuse. And so all of our child advocacy centers are working to meet these standards. And as a board member of your local child advocacy center, you have a key role to play in making sure that this is the core of what your child advocacy center is doing in your community. This is the CAC model. So I'm going to talk through them very briefly just so you have a sense of what it means to be a child advocacy center, both by our state code and also on a national level. The first standard is the multidisciplinary team. The multidisciplinary team is really the heart of a child advocacy center. It's the way that we're designed so that we're not re-victimizing that child a victim. Per the standards, a team includes a prosecutor, law enforcement, child protective services, mental health, victim advocates, and medical. And all those core members need to be there at the table working together so that they're making decisions as a group and making sure the case is progressing as it needs to be, both through the investigative and healing stages. Cultural competency and diversity is a second standard, which really threads throughout all the standards. But what it says is that you need to be taking a look at the populations of children in your community. And what are the populations that are not getting the services of either the child protection system or of your CAC? And so for some CACs in West Virginia, that may be the Hispanic population, that we're just not seeing those kids come through our doors. And we have to make a plan and really have a proactive approach to making sure that we're doing some active outreach to the communities. For some CACs in West Virginia, it's been children with developmental disabilities. So you can really look at that in different ways, but it's just making sure that we're taking a look and saying that if a child doesn't fit the mold of what we see most children are in our community, that they still get a robust and nuanced approach from our teams. The third standard is forensic interviews. And this is one of the discipline-specific standards. And what it really says is that to be a forensic interviewer at a child advocacy center, you have to have been through a nationally recognized training, and you have to have ongoing education to support your work and peer review. It's really important that forensic interviewers have ongoing training so that they are able to meet the needs of different populations in their communities. Victim support and advocacy is a standard that's really focused on how do we make sure that families can get to the next day, and how do we make sure that their needs are met. And we talked about that quite a bit earlier, but I will say that victim support and advocacy is one of the things that the movement is recognizing we need to do a better job at. Most child advocacy centers in West Virginia have a victim advocate on staff, which is a great step toward meeting the needs of children. You are able to meet the standard through community partnerships, but I really encourage CACs to take a hard look and make sure that this is being robustly met by your CAC. Medical evaluation is the next standard. This has been a huge challenge to meet in West Virginia because we don't have a lot of professionals who have the training and experience to be able to do evaluations of children who are alleged victims of abuse. We've done a lot of work around this, but the standard does have, again, training requirements so that we know that this evaluator has been through a national training that is well recognized and that they have the ongoing education once again. Mental health is a similar standard. The mental health standard actually has changed quite a bit, and it's changed for the better. One thing that is great about the standards for accreditation is that they are not stagnant. Every 5 years they are reviewed to say, does this still meet the trends that we're seeing in the field? Is this consistent with national research? And so the mental health standard used to just say that if you are a child at a child advocacy center, you need to be referred to mental health services. Well, we know now that that's not good enough because not all mental health services are designed to meet the needs of traumatized children. In fact, there are a lot of mental health services that are either harmful or produce no discernible change for that child. So the mental health services at a child advocacy center now are required to be trauma-specific, and they're required to be evidence-based. So we know that these services kids are receiving are really taking steps to reduce their symptoms that they're experiencing because of the trauma that they have endured. Case review is the next standard, which I think can be truly transformative to a community. Case review is basically something where all the team members get together once a month to make sure that they're doing an active review of open cases. Case review can be a meeting, and has been in many West Virginia communities before child advocacy centers came into being, where people get together and just kind of chit-chat about the cases. But when case review is a real process where you're taking an active role and saying, you know, what are the needs this child still has? Why don't we have the police report? It can be transformative to a community. The other thing that can happen at case review is that these overarching questions can come up. So why aren't we seeing children with disabilities on our list? Why are there no children whose cases are being brought forth to prosecution? So it's a way to really take a look at your community and say, how can we continue to do better? Case tracking, just make sure that CACs are able to pull statistical information on the children and that they're tracking the case to its conclusion. Organizational capacity is a standard that makes sure that the CAC has the resources that they need to be able to have the programs to serve the children in their community. Organizational capacity is a boring standard in a way, but I think as a board member you have a really critical role to play in making sure that your organization does have the capacity to meet the needs of children. And child-focused setting is the last one. It used to be first, and people invested all their energy in making sure that they had a really great facility. And the facility is really important, again, for the psychological safety of the child. But also, we don't want people to focus so much energy that they forget the people, which is really the thing that makes this work for kids. One great thing about the Child Advocacy Center movement is that it is a really collaborative movement, both nationally and on a statewide level. So as a staff member or as a board member, my message to you is reach out. There are so many ways to get help and assistance for what you're doing. This slide is really just a graphic representation of the different sources of help available to your Child Advocacy Center. The National Children's Alliance is, again, the accreditation and membership organization based in Washington, D.C. The regional children's advocacy centers are completely separate from the National Children's Alliance, and we're in the southern region here in West Virginia. And they're able to come and provide specialized, customized training for your community. And because they are disconnected with NCA, you know that your accreditation is never at risk if you're having a significant issue and you're really nervous to reach out, obviously, to your accrediting body. The regional CACs can come and offer assistance to you for a range of things, for strategic planning, for issues specific to your team. And then there are the chapters, and that's what we are. We are a chapter of the National Children's Alliance. And what we do is similar to NCA and to the regionals, but we're on a statewide level. And so we do legislative representation. We distribute some sub-grants to our centers. We do development training with our centers, other trainings, provide technical assistance. So there's really a range of services that the chapter can offer to your center. And if you call any one of these entities at any time, we all work very closely together. So know that if I don't know the answer, I can refer you to the people who do know the answer. This is a map of the regional CACs, and you'll see that we are in the southern region. What you see here is a visual representation of the service numbers of CACs in West Virginia. And so last year we saw 50% more kids than we did in 2009, which was the first year that we had state funding. I think that there are many reasons for that. A lot of people say, well, do you think there's more abuse of children? No, I don't think there's more abuse of children. But I think one of the things is whenever a child advocacy center is present in a local community, people learn that there is a resource that they can trust and that their case is going to be taken seriously and that they will not be left alone, but they'll have resources that help their child begin to heal. And so I think there are more disclosures being made. I think that communities are responding more effectively and systematically to these cases. So whereas some cases may have been screened out before, now they're actually getting investigated. They're actually coming to the Child Advocacy Center. The other thing that's happening is that Child Advocacy Centers are seeing a range of maltreatment. So where they used to just primarily see sexual abuse, now we're seeing drug endangerment, witness to violence, sexually exploited children. So there's really a broader scope of service for many CACs. This shows the growth of the accredited Child Advocacy Centers in our state, which is the bottom line, and the growth of the number of counties that they serve. So you can see a similar upward pattern. Currently in West Virginia, we have 21 child advocacy centers serving over half of the counties in our state officially. The structure of our organizations differs. You may be on the board of an independent nonprofit, which is the majority of our child advocacy centers in the state. About a third of our child advocacy centers that are in that independent nonprofit category, however, they are umbrellaed under a larger nonprofit. So it may be that you have a larger nonprofit that has several programs, and the Child Advocacy Center is one of the programs of Children's Home Society or of Burlington Family Services. So that's another thing that we see frequently, and a lot of times we see that in more rural communities. And then the final category is the hospital-based. We have one hospital-based CAC in West Virginia, and that's here in Charleston, West Virginia. And they have had a long-standing sexual abuse evaluation center where they did forensic interviews and medical evaluations. But they also now provide the full services of an accredited child advocacy center. So that gives you an idea of the different structures of CACs in the state. Budgets of CACs really have a broad range. A lot of our smaller startup child advocacy centers may start off with a budget of $75,000 just to pay rent and pay their director. But many times, as you develop, your CAC will provide more services, your budget will grow. And so our more developed child advocacy centers have budgets of $250,000, $300,000. And of course, our hospital-based centers' budget would be the largest because they have 2 pediatricians on staff. So there's a broad range of budgets, but we typically see budgets continue to grow as the center begins to develop. As far as board structures go, you may be a member of one of 3 types of boards. You may be on an administrative board, meaning that your child advocacy center is just getting started in your community and you're doing a lot of the work of the CAC. But once you get your 501c3 and once you really start to provide service, many times that you would be on the governing board, which is the actual decision-making body of the CAC. We've seen governing boards really shift in a very dramatic way in West Virginia. Many a times when a CAC started up, their board would be mainly comprised of members of what we consider to be the team, so prosecutors or child protective services in their community. But as CACs begin to grow, they understand that they have needs that those individuals may not have the circle of influence to meet or may not have the financial resources to meet. And so a lot of our CACs have moved from having team-based boards to more community-based boards. You may be on another type of board, which is an advisory board, meaning that you don't have governance authority over your CAC, and this would be more typical in an umbrella organization, or you may work with our hospital-based CAC. And really, you're there to be an ambassador for the CAC, to be a spokesperson, to maybe do some fundraising for them. But because there is a larger body of nonprofit, you don't have governance authority over the CAC. So one thing that's also changed for many of our CACs is the scope of activity and their staffing structure. Many of our CACs that used to refer out for services are now finding that they need to provide those in-house. One example might be that you were referring kids out for therapy, but you found that they had to be on a month waiting list before they could even see someone to do an initial assessment. And so a lot of our child advocacy centers have said we really need to be able to provide this service in a meaningful and robust way, and so we're going to find funding through a foundation or through other mechanisms to have that on site. We've seen that receipt of services is greatly increased if you have on-site services at your CAC because they've met you, they know you, they trust you. And so if you can have those services there, things that may be more challenging to receive, like therapy, because there are transportation challenges and also cultural challenges, and that many people are sort of adverse to receiving therapy. But if they've been to the CAC, they're very likely to come back and receive that service. So some current trends. One is county expansions. Many of our child advocacy centers are saying, you know what, we really are being requested to do a lot of forensic interviews for this county. We need to officially serve them so that kids can have the full range of CAC services. So we've had many county expansion efforts going on over the last few years. Another trend that we're seeing is deepening of services. A child advocacy center may have been providing mental health services for a long time, but they have been through the training to have an evidence-based provision. So now they're providing that trauma-focused counseling. They may be looking at assessment data to say, how can we get better at this? So really deepening that mental health service, deepening their victim advocacy, adding staff hours to make sure that their advocate can help families have their needs met. The medical service, maybe they were referring to a county, an hour away for their medical service, and they said, we really need to be able to provide that here in county. And so they go and they recruit someone that is willing to have the training to be able to provide that service. So many of our CACs are looking at providing better and deeper services in their local community at their child advocacy center. The second thing that I would mention is that lots of our CACs are consistently updating their practice to meet emerging needs. A couple of current trends in the field right now are child pornography, commercial sexual exploitation of children, or also called domestic sex trafficking of minors. And those things are items that we're really beginning to see much more in West Virginia. And so our CACs are taking a look at that and saying, how can we meet the needs of these victims, because they also need our services, but we may not yet be well equipped to meet their needs. As a board member, I think you have a role to play in saying to your director and to the CAC staff, are we seeing this? If so, how are we responding? Do we need to have a better response? So what's on the next frontier? As a board member, I think it's always great to be forward-looking, and if you're a new staff member at a CAC, many of these may be in your specific duties at the center. One thing that many of our child advocacy centers are taking a deeper look at is evaluation. How do we make sure that the services we're providing are really meeting the outcomes that we intend them to meet? There are a couple of ways that our CACs are doing that. One is through the outcome measurement system, which really measures two core service metrics. One is, are the families receiving the services that they need to receive, and what is their experience with that? And the second is the team piece, which is such a significant portion of what CACs do. Does the team feel like the CAC model helps facilitate investigations and helps facilitate the healing of the child? So that's one system, but some other things that our child advocacy centers are looking at are trauma assessment scores of children. Are their PTSD symptoms reduced? And so this is really a next frontier issue that we're looking at both on a statewide and you should be looking at on a local level. Second piece is awareness. Many times folks at child advocacy centers complain to me and say, everyone thinks that we're CASA, or they don't know what child advocacy centers are. Well, that's a real issue that we're trying to address in West Virginia, is really elevating the conversation around child abuse, making it a priority for the public and private sectors, just because child sexual abuse is such a crime of secrecy, until we're able to really bring it out into the open and begin to talk about it, we're never going to be able to eradicate it. So awareness is really a core thing that many CACs are thinking about and that we're trying to do on the statewide level as well. Funding diversification. There has been a significant trend away from government funding because I think that most folks know that government dollars are harder and harder to get, and many of them are being cut. So our child advocacy centers are all taking a serious look at how do we get more funding sources. Are you receiving money from the county commission? If not, that's a good place to look. But really, more realistically, are you receiving money from your private sector, from the businesses and companies within your community? Because that's the biggest area for growth at this point. Many of our CACs are seeing the need for more formal, stronger organizational structures. They've evolved from that early phase to a new level of sophistication, both in service provision and also in organizational development. So that may mean consulting with someone to do some fund development activities. It may mean making sure you have that fund development database. There are several different ways to look at the more formal organizational structures, but that's a trend that we're also seeing. Another thing is increased expectations. I think that we're no longer the new kid on the block, and so communities and funders are really looking to us to be providing a higher level of service, and I think many CACs are looking at how do we meet those expectations. And of course, the final thing is that eventually we want to make sure that every child has access to the critical and life-saving services of a child advocacy center, and that means statewide service expansion. We're trying to do that very carefully and thoughtfully and not expand at such a rate that we're putting pressure on resources that won't sustain that growth, but that is an eventual goal of our movement. So thank you so much for working at the Child Advocacy Center or for volunteering to be on a board. It's so critical that you work together and to provide the oversight and resources that are needed for growth. And if you have any questions, please always feel free to call us. Again, we're here as a resource and we want to help.